Offa and I are going to do a tag team. So I'm going to talk about health conditions among families in New Zealand, and then Offa's going to talk about caring, and then I'm going to go back to talking about some IDI research we're doing on caring. So we might kind of do some questions part way, I think, so that it's fresh in everyone's mind. So yeah, I'm a senior research fellow at Campus. I'm kind of a data researcher, and my background's in psychology, so I'm not a clinician and I don't really know much about a lot of the health conditions I'm talking about, but what I do know about is some of the psychosocial impacts that health conditions can have on individuals who experience them and on their wider family and whānau. So as Barry said, our project's part of this part of the project is a much broader study that is being run across several universities, including the University of Queensland in Australia. So a pretty wide spread out team. We've got our first in-person Project Hui the beginning of December, which is the first time we've all been able to get together anyway. So these are the conditions that I'm going to be talking about today. So we focused on 9 different conditions. It seems like more here, but we've combined AMI and coronary heart disease into one. So these are essentially the conditions that are covered by the IDI's chronic conditions data set, and these are long-term health conditions that are often grouped together. We've added dementia and mental health and behavioural conditions to that group. So there's when we're thinking about people who have these conditions, obviously some people have more than one condition, and there are people who have health conditions that we're not covering in the study, things like kidney and liver disease. And people will people who have these conditions might have them to various degrees of severity, and the effect that these conditions have on an individual will vary. So a colleague is going to be looking at that, and we will be hopefully presenting that next year. But for now, I'm just looking at basically whether an individual has one of these conditions or not. So the main source, the whole source of data for this is the IDI. So Barry showed you kind of all of the data sets that are available. So for what I'm presenting today, we are looking at health data and population data, so keeping it relatively simple. As we work through the study, or as we get towards the end of the study actually, but towards next year, I'm going to start looking more at kind of the wider impacts. So how does having a family member with a long-term health condition affect children's education? How does it affect their qualifications? We'll also look at income and work data, benefits and social services, and health as well. So what I'm presenting today is essentially some of the kind of I guess quite crude but kind of fundamental socio-demographic characteristics of individuals. For that, we're using the 2013 census. And then what I've also done is searched all of these data sets to find people who have any of those 9 health conditions or more of them. So the reason we've searched from 2008 to 2018 is we're going to start by constructing our cohort of people who have a family member with a chronic health condition in 2013, and we're going to look over time at what happens to them between 2013 and 2018. And we'll be able to look at people who didn't have a family member with a health condition in 2013, but by the time it came to 2018, somebody in their family had developed a health condition. So it's going to be quite complex going forward, and it already is, because there's a lot of data that we search for each of those conditions. One thing you can notice from this, and is common among all IDI projects, is what we don't have is primary care data. And obviously we know that for a lot of the conditions that we're talking about, particularly, diabetes and mental health conditions, people won't get to see specialist services and unless they're hospitalized or have an assessment if they're an older person, or unless they are seeing a secondary mental health service, they might not get picked up. So that's one of the reasons we included pharmaceutical dispensing and lab tests, because those are people who will be being managed in primary care, but we should be able to identify. So there's some of these conditions you can't really find another way of identifying them in primary care. I think diabetes and particularly mental health and behavioural problems, we picked up a lot of people using pharmaceutical dispensing, and you'll see the impact of that. So today, yeah, I'm just going to give a snapshot of what was happening to people in 2013. And these are the kind of main research questions. This is kind of the first paper that will come out of this study to look at who are families in New Zealand, how many families are affected by a long-term health condition, and I'm also going to be looking offer at some characteristics of young people who are providing unpaid care. So the New Zealand census includes a family identifier for everybody who's in a family nucleus. So that's either a couple with children, a couple without children, single parents with one or more children. There's various different types of family nuclei, but you also can be linked to your extended family. So if you have, you know, a couple with a child and they're also living with a grandparent of that child, that person's seen as part of the extended family. So for this study, what we did is, if somebody was living within an extended family, we counted the whole family, not just the individual nuclei of the families. We counted everybody who was part of that extended family, an identifier. So we have well over 1 million study families. Some of them they've all got at least 2 people in them. Some of them have over 19 family members living together in the same household, and that can be up to 5 family nuclei living together. And these are the most common. You can see over here the kind of most common family types. So that kind of traditional, I guess, family nuclei is the most common. So we've got one couple with children, a couple without children, single parent with, so these are all the kind of individual nuclei. But then we've got these extended families that are also quite common. So we've got one couple without children and one couple with children. So I'm guessing that's probably, you know, you've got a couple living with their parents and their children. But we've also got, yeah, we've got 41 different types. So we've got a couple without children and a single parent with children, 2 couples without children, 2 one-parent families with children. The list goes on. And we've got quite a decent number there, nearly 100,000 multi-generational families. So that, you know, within the study family, there'll be more than one generation living together. Around 500,000 of our families have at least one child. And among kind of all the individuals in these families, we've got almost 1 million children. So those are the people I'm interested in, and we'll be talking about when I do the next steps of my research. So what we did is look at, as a unit, we looked at a study family, and we looked at how many people within that family have at least one long-term health condition. And what we found was that 60% of families had at least one person who had a long-term health condition, one of the long-term health conditions that we searched for. And around, so that there was some people, you know, some families where there's just one person, about 40% of families, there's just one person, but 19% of all families had 2 or more, I think that should be, 2 or more people with a long-term condition. Some families had up to 8 people with a long-term health condition. And you can see we've broken it down in some of these slides. I break them down by different socio-demographic groups. So you can see that the proportion of families that have at least one person with a long-term health condition, and it increases as deprivation gets higher. And it's pretty much the same for having at least 2 family members with a long-term health condition. So there's kind of 2 ways of looking at this data. One is the family unit, and the other is the individuals within the family. So I like looking at the family unit because it gives us a whole picture, but it makes it a bit more difficult to think about who has a health condition and who's living with somebody with a health condition. So that's when I start looking at the individuals. So what we found was that among the whole sample, nearly 50% of people had a family member with a long-term health condition. And actually, we broke this down into 4 groups. So if there's no long-term health condition whatsoever in the family, you go in this group. If an individual has a long-term health condition and they have another family with a long-term health condition, they go into this group. So that was 16% of the whole kind of family sample that we had. They might not have a long-term health condition, but they have a family member. They might have a long-term condition, but nobody else in the family does. So when you look at these 3 groups combined, what we see is around 61% of people are exposed to or experience a health condition themselves or through a family member. So we're talking about the same as we see, kind of 60% of families are affected. That means also about 60% of individuals. And so when we look at the individual, well, we can look at some of the individual conditions that we're investigating. You can see that the kind of the proportion of families that have at least one person with these conditions and the number of people who have at least one family member are roughly similar. So what we found was a high proportion of people with mental health problems. So we've got almost 1.25 million people affected by, or families affected by having a family member that has a mental health or behavioural difficulty. And then diabetes was the next most common condition. Traumatic brain injury, also very, very common. And then you can kind of see these were ordered by their kind of prevalence. So we've got lower rates of stroke and dementia, although what we've found in our other study is that it's stroke and dementia that have the biggest kind of impact on individuals' functioning. So their ability to function day to day, and whether they're experiencing hospitalisation. So it's going to be interesting to see how that kind of maps onto the effect that these conditions have on family members. So when we look, so I'm now looking at the individuals, we can see quite a lot of differences across different ethnic groups. So Pacific peoples who seem to be more likely to have a family member with a long-term health condition. And actually, interestingly, down here, we can see that children, the proportion of children who have a family member with a long-term health condition is higher than the proportion of adults. And then we've broken that down even more. It's getting more into the kind of technical kind of crossovers of different characteristics. I call it across all ethnic groups. We see that it's people living in those highest levels of deprivation that are more likely to have a family member with one of these health conditions. And then, so this is the group I'm interested in, is children. So I'll be looking at children's outcomes. So children are less likely to have a health condition themselves. There's quite low, the proportion of children who have one of these long-term health conditions. And when you look at the conditions, you can see why. But they're much more likely to be living with a family member who has a long-term health condition. So nearly 60% when we get down to children living in the highest levels of deprivation. So this is, so yeah, what we find is there's around 900,000 children that I'll be looking at altogether, and about 57% of them, so about 500,000, are affected either by having a long-term health condition themselves or living with a family member who has a long-term health condition. So The wider project, as I've said, this is just starting to get really technical, and this just really to demonstrate the group of children that I'm interested in. But you can see that there are different patterns of whether people have a health condition or whether they have a family with a health condition, across different levels of deprivation, across different ethnicities, across men and women, or boys and girls for children. And particularly we see this quite different pattern among children. So I'm going to be really interested to look at these children. It's not an insignificant number of children that are affected. It's quite a large number. So yeah, I will be looking at, well, how does having a family member with a long-term health condition affect families over time? How does it affect who lives in the family? How does it affect the socio-economic circumstances of the family as a unit? And then I'm particularly interested in health and education outcomes for children, but we've also got projects looking at outcomes for people whose partner has had a stroke or has had a traumatic brain injury, elderly family members that are living with another family member that has a long-term health condition, and what's the other one? There's another one.
Socioeconomics for children.
Yeah.
That's it.
Okay. And well, at some point I want to look at parents of children with a health condition as well. Yeah, so that's kind of so the idea is, the way that we're working through this project is feeding back information to, say, Offer and her project, so that we can provide data for Offer to share with the community, and they can then reflect on that, discuss it, and then kind of get back to us via Offer to say, well, have you thought about looking at this? And we think this is important. So I'll hand over to Offer to talk about her work.
Hello, Fanny, everyone. Happy Tokelau Language Week. I'm sorry. And congratulations, Wellington. You won the NPC on Saturday. And yes, well done to Wellington. My son Graham is the forwards coach for Northland. The Taniwha beat Wellington during the series. And so it's so exciting to know that we run with champions. And, you know, you're all champions here, and I'm humbled to be talking with you today. In our culture, you know, it's talanoa. We have a conversation and we tell our stories, we share our stories with you. And yes, it's amazing to be running with champions. And on the screen are the champions that I'm excited to run with. And when the community knows that our researchers are running with champions like Barry and the rest of the campus team, the National Science Challenges, 3 health-related National Science Challenges, the scientists at the Morris Wilkins Center for Molecular Medicine and Biodiscovery, and of course, the Pacific Primary Healthcare Services in the community, both in Auckland and in Wellington, and in the South Island as well. It makes them want to take part in the research because they believe in the value of data and how that data and our research can have a clear line of focus to practice and also to models of care. So I'd also want to mention another exciting opportunity that has happened this month, and that is the incorporation of the Langimalie Research Centre within the Tongan Health Society. And I've been appointed as their Director of Research. And it's just so wonderful. And I thank Barry for his understanding and allowing me to reduce my time on campus so that I can continue the work with our communities at that level. So Malo, and keep in mind, we're running with champions. Just a bit of background to acknowledge the debilitating effects that the sufferers of people with chronic conditions experiencing. And I just go back to the important leaders here who are our champions in the community. The research is set in both Auckland and Wellington, and our team in Auckland comprise these 4 community leaders, and of course Wellington leaders at the Pahina Church in Porirua. And you know, when they first heard about the project from us, they believed in it, they wanted to take part, because some of them recall the work that the late Dr. Ian Pryor undertook with the Tokelauan peoples in Tokelau and also here in Wellington. And you may be aware that his study is still upheld today as an exemplary work in epidemiology. And so it was no problem for the community to say, yes, we want to be part of this and we want to contribute to the solutions to address these issues that they're facing, build on the research that has been completed and the research that we look to do in the future, and create new ways of doing, so that Tokelau's example may be extended to other population groups in New Zealand and also in the Pacific region. And why Tokelau, you ask? Well, when you look across the research, it's the people with whose voices are the least heard that we want to know about. And it's fine to understand the experiences of other population groups, but just because a community is the least in number doesn't mean to say that they're the least important. Their experiences are just as valuable to all of us. And while the numbers may be small, we can together combine them to give us a pan-Pacific view. But it's also important to understand what each individual group experiences and understand the diversity in each of those Pacific groups. Our aim clearly is to understand the impact of these conditions on the Tokelau peoples, and the severity of the chronic conditions they're experiencing and how they're coping. And I want to focus on the strategies that they're applying themselves to manage their conditions and how the services are supporting them. But also we are aware that there are gaps in those services. But the focus of the community is, let's work on getting the solutions and improving what services are available now. So our methods clearly to apply a culturally appropriate, people-centered approach. We use the Tokelau language in our engagement with them. So when I have my meetings with the communities in Auckland and in Wellington, they will speak in the Tokelau language, and then someone will translate it to me in English. I will respond in English, and then we have my Talanoa translated into the Tokelau language. And of course, that takes time. You need patience and understanding. But during that time, there's storytelling, a lot of humor, a lot of laughter comes in our conversations, and but that's our way of communicating and building the relationship and trust. And as we get to know each other, we understand each other, and people then feel they want to share their experiences, and that they know that the information we collect from them will be treated with respect, communicated in the way that they expect it to be told, and ensure that they are presented in a positive light and in the right spirit. So in applying a Pacific approach, Talanoa, in our conversations, and because this is work with the Tokelau community, it's important then that we apply their models of health, Te Waka Atawhanga, which includes a holistic approach to the issues that they face in body, mind, and spirit. Reciprocity and respect are important to them. And this is also reinforced in the Health Research Council Pacific guidelines for doing research with Pacific communities. Our study was designed to interview 12 family groups. And after that was completed, one family approached me and said, we want to take part in this also. They apologized for not joining the study during the time that we planned for it, but they had reasons. there was a hospitalization in the family and they needed to attend to that first. So of course, we have now 13 family groups that took part in the study. 12 community workshops were planned. And yes, one group completed all 6 community workshops that were designed for them. Another 6 was planned, but the community group there involved, after their 3rd community workshop, they decided, no, we've had enough of talk. It's time to put into action the intervention we want for our community. And that's fine. You know, this points to the need to be flexible and respond proactively to what the community wants to do. When they know they've had enough talking, it's time to work, then you be ready to run with them. And so the analysis for this work I'll be taking a narrative and thematic approach to it. In terms of work in progress, I've talked with over 100 participants, and I know there will still be more as members in the community come into our workshops. It's the community-led intervention that we're working on at the moment. Our evaluation of the intervention is pending, and so are our 6 focus group interviews. And of course, 6 digital stories are planned. And our first digital story will be tomorrow with the Auckland community, when I will be with them to celebrate their culture and language as part of Tokelau Language Week. And I understand it will be the first time in any of these language weeks that a research activity will be brought into their conversation, and the community members and leaders themselves will be sharing their experiences in this project. The remaining digital stories will follow, and that will include participants telling their own story in their own words. So that's not just me reporting to the rest of you about the study, but they have a chance to articulate their own voice. And then we will continue to maintain our connections with the leaders and the community. So just to go through some of the key themes that we identified in our interviews. In terms of formal support, it was across primary healthcare, and included in that is the self-management of their chronic conditions, hospital care, home-based services. There's some families that require these services to attend to their personal needs at home. Government services, that includes WINS, benefit support, and also the media. This is one way that they connect with Pacific Radio, the language programs, and how they can keep up to date with news in general, and particularly during COVID, when all the messaging was also shared via different media networks. Informal supports was also very important for the communities in terms of the care that family members provided for them, friends, community groups such as their churches, and social groups. For example, the older members of the community would have their old people's programs, and they'll meet once a week. And some of them who can identify other community events for the older adults will go and join them, the Tongan group or the Samoan group, and that's their way of socializing and keeping in contact with others in the community. Technology played a very important part, particularly for younger members in the family with their social media networks. And of course, for Pacific people, the Coconut Wireless is alive and well, and they stay very connected, not only in New Zealand through that way of taking a healthy interest in each other and with others, but also connecting with family in their Pacific nation homes. Now, during COVID, the interviews with the family groups, sorry, that should have been family groups, not the focus groups, were conducted during 2020 through to May 21. And during that time, it provided additional challenges for the participants and their families, due in particular to the restrictions, lockdown, and also it affected me and my team because we were unable to reach them, and also we had a preference to only meet face to face and not continue the research online. And my research assistants, needed to find alternative work. And so for much of the time, I had to continue and ensure that these connections with the communities were had once the restrictions were lifted and we could connect again. But that meant that in addition to my audio recorder and the consent forms and all the other paperwork and pens, I needed to add sanitizers, masks, and other information about COVID, and be prepared to answer the questions they might bring up regarding COVID, and also connect them with the different programs that the Ministry for Pacific Peoples was putting online at the time to keep the communities informed. And also, Tongan Health Society is an integrated primary health care and social service in Auckland with 3 clinics, Langimalia clinics, and a 4th one is just about to be opened. But they were out at the front line also with the carrying out the tests for the community and vaccinations, and continuing with the vaccination programs today, and offering the whole suite of vaccines for the community, including the Tokelau community. So I kept connecting with them and telling them where the different services will be provided around Auckland. And because I'm Auckland based, my connections with them are more frequent than the community here in Wellington. However, Barry knows that I schedule regular meetings to come to Wellington and make sure that we don't miss the links there with them. Some of the preliminary results from the data I've collected so far is the range of lived experiences within families, significant lifestyle changes and coping mechanisms. Christianity is very important for this community, and in fact, across the whole of Pacific population group. And one thing that stood out for me was how families would organize themselves as if they are conducting their own board meetings. And yes, I encourage them to continue with that, because they too are the governors in their homes and in their families. They too make the decisions around finance and other resourcing and appointments for the family members who are suffering from the different chronic conditions they have. And caring for them at home was very, very important. So it's important to note that informal supports for our Pacific communities, and it's highlighted again here with Tokelau, the informal support is very important. And definitely COVID-19 affected these families. The impact was very significant. And the implications for practice and policy, I would say, Pacific peoples, the families and the communities, they have the experience and knowledge to inform the health and well-being policies and programs that will make a positive difference for them. We need to empower them and watch them win. That's very exciting to see people succeed in developing what is needed for them and to live their lives independently, despite all the challenges. We are fully aware of that, but there are ways of doing that they can support themselves with all of our support indeed. So next steps for me until June 23, when this project is scheduled to end, is to complete the community intervention and the evaluation, focus group interviews, and our digital storytelling, the first of which will begin tomorrow. Analyze the full data set and disseminate our study findings. Work with stakeholders to translate the findings into action. And next year, our plan is to schedule the next whānau. Some of you may be aware that that last year, actually, in June 21, we hosted the inaugural Pacific whānau in the community. That attracted international interest and funding for the next whānau. And we were able to host this year's whānau again in June in the community. And as a result of those first two whānaus or conferences, community requested that they want the next whānau in the Cook Islands. So I'm in discussions with the Cook Islands government to host the next whānau there next year. And I hope that will pique some interest among you to come to the Cook Islands and hear some more of our whānau. Just 3 references I will share with you here. The book published recently by the last year by the National Science Challenge for Aging Well, University of Otago, celebrating the first 5 years of research. And one of the projects that I led is included in that book, the Carer Strategy Action Plan, which we helped to inform as part of our previous research with Pacific Family Carers. And just this year, the publication of our protocol. So more detail about this project I've just talked about is in that paper published in the New Zealand Journal of Primary Healthcare. And so it leaves me now to say thank you very much, particularly to our participants and the Tokelau community leaders. The Tongan Health Society, subcontractor to this project, so is the New Zealand Council of Christian Social Services, which is based, the head office is based here in Wellington, and of course Compass, and the Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment for funding of our work. And University of Otago and University of Auckland for the administrative support and directorship through the of these challenges, and to each one of you for your attendance and attention. Malo aupito. Thank you.
So when we were kind of running our initial searches for those long-term health conditions, and Offa was doing her work thinking about carers who have a family member with conditions, we got in touch with Lauren Donnan, who was doing her PhD on young carers and the impact that being a carer has on young people. And we realized that we could actually look at some of this data in a somewhat limited way, but there is some data available in the census. So the census asks questions about 6 different types of unpaid care that people might have been doing, and 2 of those questions are about whether anybody who is aged over 15 and over gets asked these questions, and it's about whether they've looked after a family member of their household who's ill or has a disability, or they've helped someone who doesn't live in their household. So we thought this was a really great opportunity to look at this group of young people who are kind of have been a bit left out of some research, or it's very difficult to kind of access these young people and information on them. We are limited in that we can't look at any data from anybody who's under 15, and we know there are carers who are that young. And of course, it's only if somebody kind of recognise themselves as looking after a member of their household who has an illness that we'll be able to identify them as being a young carer. Well, I think what we might do is also look at some of these variables, because the chances are if a young person has a family member with a long-term health condition, they might have more responsibilities around housework and looking after children than they would if they didn't have a family member with a chronic condition. So one thing we're not able to do at the moment is, we don't know who they're looking after. We're not able to link to the person that they are looking after and see kind of who they are and what conditions they have. So we're looking at this data kind of on its own, but also feeding that back to Offa and to Lauren, who works for or is kind of established a young carers network, and to some other young carers organisations. So ultimately what we found was 7% of young people, so altogether there were just over 608,000 people aged 15 to 24 who took part in the 2013 census, and 7% of them were providing unpaid care for someone either in their household or outside of their household. So around 1 in 25 people, about that's 4%, are providing unpaid care to someone within their household. Similar proportion providing unpaid care for someone outside their household. And there are a small number of people, it's about 1 in 100, but you know, a considerable group of young people who are providing unpaid care to somebody in their household and perhaps somebody else, or hard to know, but they're providing care to someone who has an illness or disability outside of their household as well. And so just to be clear, yeah, these could be any disabilities or illnesses. There's nothing more specific that we can find out about those. So it won't just be kind of the conditions I was talking about earlier. This will be any illness or condition. So overall, we've got 42,000 young people. So I've looked at, you know, just the numbers of people. So these, and I should have mentioned this earlier, we've used total response categories for ethnicity. So some people will be in more than one category. And for the other work that I presented, we have looked at level 2 ethnicity as well, because we're aware that using these broad categorizations might not tell the whole story. So we do have that data, and we'll be looking to feed that back to specific communities to help them to understand what's happening for families. So most of young carers are women. That women are young and girls are kind of overrepresented. We've got roughly equal kind of proportions of people in each age group. We can see that more young carers are living in deprivation than not. And when we look at kind of what proportion of young people are carers, we can see that the higher levels of deprivation, the more likely it is that a young person is providing care to somebody else. And that's kind of across all ethnicities. And we can see there's quite a big difference among level 1 ethnicity groups anyway in the proportion of young people who are providing care to somebody. So we've got, you know, really kind of low proportion down here, and then really high proportion among Māori and Pacifica. So this is how it looks across level 2 ethnicities, and this is why I think this just demonstrates why it's so important not to just group everybody together, because we see these really big variations among Pacific peoples, and of course among Middle Eastern, Latin American, African, kind of quite different patterns that we see here. So I think this going forward, and when we're feeding back to the communities, this is what's going to be the important information. So we can see that actually we were right to choose Tokelauan community to think about carers, because the Tokelauan community have the highest number, or highest proportion, sorry, not the highest number, highest proportion of young people providing care. And just to see, there's also big differences across, particularly across Pacific peoples, in terms of whether carers are male or female. We're also seeing some differences as well according to the age group that are providing that care. And so particularly for Tokelau, we seem to see that it's this kind of middle age group, those aged 19 to 21, that are more likely, or have higher proportion of people that are providing care. Whereas for other groups, usually the kind of proportion increases with age. So what I will be looking at next, that was 2013, what we're going to be looking at next. So what about what was happening in 2018? What changed between, if anything, between 2013 and 18? And how does that compare? Are we seeing a higher proportion of young people providing care? Lower? Are the characteristics of those people different? And I also want to follow up individuals from 2013. Were they still providing care to somebody when in 2018, 5 years later? Who are those people? Maybe they're no longer providing care for somebody. Who are those? What are the characteristics of that group? And then I'll also be looking at, you know, what happens to young people over time if they're providing care to someone? How are their education and health outcomes, and particularly access to mental health services? How does that differ? So yeah, we're feeding all this back to Offa and to various young carer groups. I think Offa and I will take questions. We've got a bit of time to do that. Any? Yep.
You mentioned that you at one point linked conditions to the amount of care and support people need in the family.
That's something it's very difficult to so what we will be doing is, if an individual has a chronic health condition, we can link to other census data that tells us whether they have difficulty with day-to-day living, so dressing and walking, and whether they have difficulties with any sensory impairments. So we'll know kind of whether they're having long periods of hospitalization or they're going to hospital. So we kind of know about them, how that impacts their family. We can't quite tell, but I guess that's what we're looking at. Does that have an impact on family in terms of their ability to work and on their health as well? That's right. Yeah.
Does the family size play much of a, like, how does that interplay?
I don't know yet. I'm going to find out. That would be a big part of it. And whether the family has children or not will be, I think, a big part of it as well. Yeah.
So a couple of questions on the first bit. When you talk about children versus adults, is that differentiation based on age?
Yeah. Yeah, so that's where it gets a bit tricky with the terminology, because the census defines a child as somebody who lives with their parents, whereas we are defining a child as somebody who's under 18. So we've used that age cutoff to say, mainly because of the kind of outcomes that we'll be looking at. So when we're looking at children, we'll be looking at young children and some of the before school check information, and then we'll be looking at a slightly older group and whether they what qualifications they achieved at NCA 1 to 3, and then the slightly older group, are they in education or training, and have they found work? So yeah, under 18s is what I'm looking at.
Another question is also about this. So when your target population is families who live within a household, right?
Yeah.
Is there a reason why you decided to choose just the families living within the household, not everybody?
Yes. Well, that was a tricky part of defining the cohort. I guess for us, it's quite difficult if you look at the household level to know what the relationships are between individuals in the household, and some households are enormous. If you just use household identifier, there's households, because of student halls or something, you might have so many people. So we wanted to keep it to that family level, but we could look at other people who are in the household. It kind of gets tricky knowing who's who and what relationship they have to one another. Yeah.
Because I was just a comment on that. You using data till 2018, so I guess that won't be much of a difference. But if you look at the COVID effect, and if you go further and look at take the 2023 census, I think that household
yes
it was very
it's going to be so interesting to me. We have to wait for a couple of years to get the 23 data. Was there a question on?
More funding is what we need to do there. There are a ton of questions on the chat.
Oh my goodness.
Creating a lot of interest. How do you define, so I'll just rattle through,
Yeah.
if that's okay? How do you find multi-generational families? Would you say this covers whānau Māori?
It's defined by the census. So the census gives an extended family type, which is either one generation, two generation, three generation. It's very hard to work out who's who within a family definitively.
Okay, so to answer this question, perhaps there are families and household experts within Stats New Zealand who come up who apply those definitions. So they've been, we're using those. You may touch on this one quickly. I guess I may have missed it, but I'd be interested to understand the definition of long-term health condition.
We don't have a definition. It's the term we're using to describe the 9 health conditions that we are looking at. So
So the chronic conditions are defined by the Ministry of Health.
yes.
Okay, you probably touched on this one. Do you look at trends by different ethnic groups? If so, how granular can the IDI go?
Well, yes, we can go down to level 2 ethnicity, which, I mean, there's still obviously big, there's a big difference in some of these populations, particularly, I think, African. We've got an entire continent covered by one level 2 ethnicity. I do think level 2 ethnicity tells you more. But when we publish, whether international journals want to know about that level, I don't know. But yeah, that's going to be the best way forward.
And here's one we can chat about for ages,
Oh.
but let's not. Can we assume that there is likely an undercount of mental health behaviour because it's relying on a diagnosis and not everyone who's had these conditions and who has these conditions will have had one?
Yes, well, it doesn't rely on a diagnosis because we use that pharmaceutical data. So essentially, if somebody was prescribed any kind of mental health, and there's debate there as well about whether some of these drugs are really prescribed for mental health or behavioural conditions. We know there's crossover. For some medications, we've tried to exclude where we think somebody might be prescribed. Say if we have a young person being prescribed benzodiazepine, we're going to assume that's for epilepsy, not for a mental health problem, because young people shouldn't be getting prescriptions for benzodiazepine. So anybody who was prescribed mental health medication at least twice over a period of 12 months, we count them as having a mental. So it's a pretty broad criteria, and that's why we see so many people with mental health and behavioural conditions, because we've tried to capture, as it were, as many people as we can.
Did you look at how rates for individuals change when you include single people living with no family members? That might be the Andrea question.
Yes, we haven't looked at that because we're only interested in families in this study.
Publishing a paper just looking at chronic conditions and
Yes,
generally.
yes.
Yeah. Thanks, Moira, for that one. When looking at lifecourse, can you please provide us with some context? Different stages of life.
Yes, so we're going to be looking at how having a family. So it's 2 ways of looking at it. How having a family member with a health condition affects, say, children versus adults or young people and older people. But I guess it's also about when the person has, whether it's a childhood illness or whether it's an illness that affects people later in the life course. So things like dementia, and a lot of these conditions are higher, apart from, again, so mental health and behavioural conditions we see actually, they do rise steeply towards a very kind of higher ages, but we see a kind of peak in lower to middle adulthood, and TBI we see more flatter rates of TBI, and they're particularly high in children. So that's going to be, there's a kind of crossover of life course stages that we'll be looking at.
And for our Pacific groups, particularly Tokelau, it's intergenerational.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Of families living in the same home, and that was our key interest also.
Yeah, so we know that there'll be kind of conditions will cluster perhaps within families. Probably again, TBI might be less likely, although I don't know.
Okay, we're digging slightly into Aru's time here, but 2 final questions, because
Yeah.
I think they're kind of interesting. It looks like those aged 15 to 18 have higher rates of caring than the other older groups, but it's a 4-year age group rather than 3-year age group.
Yeah.
Is that right? Seems a surprising result. hang on. Perhaps school gives young people more time to provide care than later study work does. We don't know the answer.
Yeah, we don't know the answer yet, but we will have it next year.
And then I'll take your first but not second question. Sorry, Pratika. Is heterogeneity within groups analysed? Does the Fijian group include both Tokai and Fijian Indian groups? I can answer that myself. Fijian Indian is not included amongst Fijian and the current ethnicity standard in New Zealand.
Yes, yes. So there are limitations to what the census can tell us about people's ethnic groups, and so Fijian Indians are grouped
under Indian, under level 2 under Indian.
And so in these groups, they will be under other Asian peoples.
Oh, you might be right, actually.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. So yeah, it makes things tricky. I mean, that's how it goes, I think. And just Chris, you had a question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lisa, and offer. Very interesting. So we've got some of the stuff too, and intergenerational stuff's complex because two things. One is the intergenerational period is very different in different ethnic groups. So Māori and Pacific tend to have children much younger age, and New Zealand Europeans tend to have them longer. So the period's different. And the onset of chronic conditions for Māori and Pacific is also earlier. So you've got different things resulting in younger people providing care for people with long-term conditions who are also younger. Yes. So how do you disentangle some of that stuff with those? And I think the period thing is really important. So, you know, your typical Māori first-time mother is about 19, and your typical Pākehā first-time mother is just top 30. Yeah. So you've got very different outcomes for the mother and the father. Yes. I think we'll just have to make sure we take the right variables into account. So age of the person who has a health condition will be important, age of the child, when I'm looking at children, and how long it's been that child has been living with someone with a health condition, because it might be something that's quite recent, or it might be something they've lived with their whole life. So it's just a case of making sure we. The other thing we think is, you know, the question about helping someone outside your household. Yes. It depends what people think helping. I know. Because providing money might be considered helping, rather than going around and mowing the lawns or something. So. Yeah, so different questions slightly, aren't they? This is looked after. They're not the same. Yeah, no, it's true. So they are. Somebody might be, particularly communities who tithe or provide financial support, you might overestimate. Yeah, well, also like looked after is quite narrow, because actually you might be helping but actually, so you can. This is why I'm quite interested in also looking over this, because I would say it's going to get complicated. But anyway, I should pass over to Arison while I can.
Thank you.
Thank you.